So I'm going to try to give you an overview of a little history on Pittsford Farms, which is the farm where Pittsford Farms Dairy is located today. And the history starts in 1814 when Samuel Hildreth arrived in Pittsford from eastern New York State and purchased 50 acres of land on North Main Street. He built the house that's there today. This is actually a photograph of Hosmer's Tavern in at the Genesee Country Museum because Hildreth had a general store, a tavern. The general store is located where Breathe at Home or the Hicks and McCarthy building is located today. The tavern is the building where Breathe Yoga is located today. And originally, his house and his tavern were basically identical and looked about like the building in the photograph. And if you look carefully at the end of Breathe Yoga today on the north end of the building, there's actually an embossed pattern on the trim below the eaves that matches the exact same pattern that's also found on his house. The primary business that Samuel Hildreth had was a stagecoach business, and he built a network because there was no canal or railroads at that time. And New York State had recently built a number of roads, including Ridge Road, Route 31, which was called State Road, and Routes 5 and 20 to encourage settlement in the western part of the state. And all of these became stagecoach routes. Because Pittsford was located at the intersection of the two most important roads in eastern Monroe County, State Road and the main road that went from Genesee Falls to Canandaigua, the first settlement in our area. That's why he located his stagecoach business here. And as a result, there were actually several inns that were formed. Next slide, please. Including the Phoenix Inn that's of course, at the Four Corners, his tavern on South Main Street, and the White Tavern, which was located where the Pittsford Library is. Originally, his house faced south because his barns were located where Robert's Kitchen is today on North Main Street. And those barns were torn down in 1834 when the Rochester and Auburn Railroad came through. And ironically, Samuel Hildreth died the same year the railroad essentially put his stagecoach business out of business. Trains could obviously handle much more freight and were much quicker. Both his home and the next slide, please. This is a late 19th century view of Hildreth's Tavern on South Main Street, which had been the dormer is a later addition, as is the storefront. The staircase, at one point, town meetings were held in this building, but you can see that both of these buildings originally looked like the first slide, that tavern at the Genesee Country Museum. Next slide, please. This map shows you the blue. I don't know if you can see my arrow, probably not. But the blue represents Hildreth's house. The green is the location of the stables. And the three red sort of orange blobs down lower in the map, those are the three early inns that were located in the village of Pittsford. So even before the canal opened, the village was really forming as a settlement around the Four Corners because it was the intersection of these two routes. Next slide, please. This map is actually from 1850s, but it gives you a sense of what the village was like. Now, this shows the canal was relocated to its current location in 1860s, when it was originally the canal through Pittsford was 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. And Jarvis Lord, who came to Pittsford from Ballston Spa and worked as a farmhand on the Guernsey farm. The Guernsey farm was the big farm that eventually became the Mitchell Estate on Mitchell Road. And all the land basically between the village boundary and where the post office is today, almost 300 acres, was the Guernsey farm. Anyway, Lord worked there and then started these side businesses, including contracting, and had many business interests in Rochester. but he made a fortune as a contractor for widening the canal through Pittsburgh. And so with the money that he had used, he purchased the Samuel Hildreth's farm. Now, ironically, after Hildreth died, G.K. Wood, who was the station master of the railroad station that was built right across from Samuel Hildreth's house, bought his farm and lived there. With his new money, Jarvis Lord purchased his farm and eventually added two other farms to it, which is why today Pittsford Farms Dairy has an S in it, because it was the White Farm, which was located on Stoutenburg Road, now Gulf Avenue, which is where Roger and Betsy Powers live today. And the Plum Farm, which was a farm where the farmhouse was segmented from its farmland by the relocation of the canal. And that house, for Thomas Plum's house, is the Israel Stone House, which is located next to the library, very close to State Street and the intersection of South Street. Next slide, please. This map, this shows the village in 1862, and you can see that you can see the extent of Samuel Hildreth's farm, which at that point was owned by Daniel Wood, which was G.K. Wood's son, apparently. And you can also see, both the location of the original canal and then where Jarvis Lord dug the new ditch. And the fact that he was a contractor provided him, when they dug the canal, they had to dig into a rock escarpment that underlies the center of the village. So there was a lot of rock that came from the excavation. And some of that rock was used in the stone wall that today is a retaining wall on the front of the dairy property. The other part was used for the foundation of the barns on the property. An interesting note is that because of the canal, the grade of and the railroads, the grade on North Main Street has changed significantly. Before the canal and the railroad, there wasn't much of a hill on North Main Street. But the railroad, to keep the grade, they dug that down. And then when the canal was widened, the hill became steeper. And that's why if you look at the front of the main house on Pittsford Farms today, it sits up on a little hill behind a retaining wall. That was all because of the canal and the railroad. Next slide, please. Oh, this slide is out of order, but that's okay. Later on, this is okay. Yeah, this is great. Thank you. This is a picture of Jarvis Lord's house in July 4th, 1870. And if you look closely, you can see his family is on the porch. The house had just been completely renovated and expanded. The barns are all new. The wall and everything had just been added. One interesting thing I find in this photograph is there's the little tree that's just in front of the fence. That tree is still there, and it's about a 90-foot tall horse chestnut tree. There's one of the Norway spruce in the lawn today is over 100 feet tall. But what's another interesting thing here is look at the rough condition of North Main Street. It really was just a dirt path at this point. Next slide. This is the way the house looks today, and you can see that this porch, which is its most architecturally significant feature, really dominates the house. But Jarvis really transformed it. And what's interesting is there was a fad architectural. There's been a series of fads that have come through Pittsford, and there were several other houses that were also renovated in the same way. And one of them is the big yellow house on Washington Road. That was Nathaniel Lord, which was Jarvis Lord's brother. There's also the house across from St. Louis Church, which today, that was also an early 1820s house, just like Samuel Hildreth's house. That at one point looked just like this, and then it was renovated again in the 1920s. Jarvis Lord served 4 terms as Pittsford Town Supervisor. He was a member of the board of the Rochester Savings Bank. He also owned a foundry and an ironworks in Charlotte and had a number of other different business district interests. He eventually became an assemblyman and then a state senator. And then before he died, his son got involved in canal scandals that apparently there were kickbacks at the state level, and he was disgraced. His widow, Zelpha Lord, sold it to his cousin, Estelle Hawley, who was from Brooklyn, New York. Next slide. This map is from 1872. You can see this is probably shortly after Jarvis Lord acquired the farm. It only shows the house in this thing, but you can still see the location of the plum farm, and then the plum house is right there next to State Street, close to the intersection of South Street. Next slide. Okay. So after the Hawleys bought the property, Frank Hawley was a business entrepreneur with a variety of interests, including harnessing. One of his projects was to harness Niagara Falls with electricity with a cataract electric company. He experimented with electrically driven canal boats. He had a mining operation in Franklin, New York, and in Pennsylvania. And he basically expanded the farm operation and it turned the place into a show place. And this is a drawing from an old Sanborn map that shows you the barns that existed around the turn of the century. And the main barn, some of these had been built by Jarvis Lord, but Hawley moved the barns around and reconfigured them into this. There was a courtyard in the interior that was about half an acre. So the top wing was the dairy cows. On the left side, one part was cows, and then below that was a pony stable that was later converted into a calving area. The horse stables on the south part, eventually, because the farm developed a business selling Shetland ponies. Eventually, those were all converted to Shetland pony stalls. And then the right side, there was a big two-story archway that allowed the dairy cows to go out into the cow pastures. And then the other two, there were two open pens on either side that were used for heifers. Then there's a row of small buildings from the top. There's a smokehouse that's still there. Then there's a hen house, which also still exists today, a shed and a corn crib, which are no longer there, a scales, which is no longer there, and the wagon shed still exists today. Next slide. This is a picture of the newly renovated barn. You can see it's quite large and had an Italian style cupola that matched the style of the main house. There's a gas lamp here. There were shutters on the windows. It was one of the largest barns in New York State. If anybody is familiar with Saunier, there still exists in Saunier a barn very similar in design to this. It also encloses a courtyard on four sides. If you look at the extreme left side of the photo, you can see a windmill. Next slide. Frank Hawley was notorious for publicizing his success, kind of like a Donald Trump of that era. And he had a number of articles that were published in agricultural periodicals at the time. This was stationery that was drawn, and there's drawings, so we have a good handle of what the barn looks like. This is the view we just saw on the left, and on the right is the back of the barn that faced out towards the farm. Next slide. This is a view from the farm from the lawn of the main house. When I was a kid, this is the view that still existed. Next slide. One of the things that Hawley did was introduce what was called scientific dairy farming, and all of the latest innovations in milking cows and animal husbandry were introduced in terms of breeding and everything else, feed and so forth, were introduced on the farm. He actually built this building, which was the creamery. And in the front part of the building, there was a porch, and right inside of there was a little dairy plant. This was the original dairy. They had a de Lavelle separator, which was essentially a centrifuge that separated the cream, and they made butter, which was shipped by a private rail siding to New York City. If you look at the building carefully, the back of it, you can see there's a gabled wing with big doors on it. That was an ice house to keep the butter cold, and they cut ice from the canal and they put it in there, and that's how they originally they refrigerated the products that were made in the creamery. Next slide. The farm became famous for its Shetland ponies. The Hawleys hired a English groom, Frank Cook or Fred Cook, who eventually became the farm manager, and he started breeding Shetland ponies so successfully that they were sold. And there was a fad at that time in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. It was a big fad for wealthy families to buy Shetland ponies as pets for their kids with little buggies, because it was a safe way to learn how to drive a buggy. And they were sold and exhibited throughout the United States. The farm won several first prizes at the World's Fair in Chicago and many other exhibitions. They actually sold a pony to Queen Victoria from Pittsford Farms in Pittsford, New York. Next slide. I mentioned before that the farm absorbed the White farm because Mr. White retired and moved into the village to a house that today Dave Ferris lives on in Monroe Avenue. This is a view. If you look carefully at the right side of this photograph, you can see the abutment of what today is the Gulf Avenue railroad overpass. This is the way the White farm looked when it was incorporated into the farm. I believe this large barn was one of the barns that was moved by the Hawleys and moved to where the main farmstead is and attached to the main barn. Next slide. The farm had a pond. There was a herd of Shropshire sheep and exotic deer that were kept in a pen by this pond. There still are a number of ponds out here. You'll see this little building at one point was located by the pond, and then later on it was moved back into where the main group of outbuildings exists today. But this building on the left still exists. Next slide. So in addition to the ponies, the farm had a full set of sleighs, carriages, and buggies. Frank was notorious for inviting guests from New York City and then taking them out in a carriage with 4 horses in front of it and giving them tours and basically showing them around Pittsford. According to stories from the Knickerbocker family, he would take them up to the top of Knickerbocker Hill and show them that beautiful view that we still have today and say, I own all of this. And it kind of ticked off the farmers in town because, of course, he owned none of it. Next slide, please. These are actually drawings that were published in some of the national agricultural periodicals of the farm because it pioneered the humane treatment of cows. And you can see the top shed is the calving area of the cow barn, and the lower one shows this is a barn again that still exists today, but this was the heifer barn. Next slide. This is a map of the farm that was drawn probably about 20 years ago by my aunt's husband, Roger Powers, because the Powers family farms the farm today. But the point of this is the Hawleys had a landscape architect that laid out a plan for the farm. And at one point there was a large orchard. And then if you look at the left side of the drawing, which is where the house, the dairy, and the main barns are, there's a lane that goes out and then it splits. At one point, this went out and went in a big square, and that square was called the Mile Square, and it was laid out that way because they would take the horses and the ponies and they would exercise them around that square on a daily basis to make sure they stayed healthy. In the 1950s, 80 years after this, the Hollies, the state planned an expressway that would have gone right through the middle of the farm, right by the end of the house. And fortunately, my grandfather, who had a fair amount of clout at that time, got them to move it to the west. So it only segmented and isolated this one field that still exists today between the expressway and Monroe Golf Club. Next slide. This is a picture of the smokehouse, which still exists today. Meat that was butchered on the farm. This was how they preserved it, and most of the farms in Pittsford had something similar to this. That smokehouses were usually made of stone or wood, but there's one on the Hopkins farm that's actually a wood smokehouse. So as long as you didn't burn it down, it worked. And you would leave the meat in here for a few days, and that's how they preserved it. Next slide. This is a picture of Fred Cook, the manager, with a pony, one of the ponies on the farm. Next slide. This is on the left is a picture of the creamery with Fred Cook from England, Billy Beers, who is a groom who is also from England, and I believe this one is sorry, it was a Hawley's son was dressed up. And this is Florence Hawley on the porch behind him. On the right is part of the collection of buggies and carriages that was in the main wing of the barn. And below is Fred Cook with some of the Shetland ponies on the farm. Next slide. This is a picture of the main house. I believe this was still taken when Jarvis Lord owned it, because that looks like Jarvis Lord standing on the steps, and I think it's maybe with his wife and daughter, Alpha Lord, and I'm not sure what his daughter's name was. At that time, the circle had a slightly different configuration than it does today, and you notice that there's a jockey statue that's standing there that was next to the driveway. So you would hitch, that was a hitching post. The carriages would come up here. You can see there's steps. It's not steps, it's actually a carriage block. So you could get out of the carriage and go directly onto the front porch and into the front of the house. This is the wall that I was talking about with the stone that was excavated from the Erie Canal. And this is a Gothic revival fence that I believe is from the Roberts Foundry in Philadelphia. Next slide, please. There were several lawn ornaments. Jarvis Lord had laid out the property like a romantic period, mid-19th century country estate. The statue of Mercury was purchased from the Roberts Foundry in Philadelphia. And some of you may have seen on Facebook, Lord was friends with Mr. Kimball, who owned the Kimball and Tobacco Factory and Peerless Tobacco Company, which was located in downtown Rochester. Mr. Kimball admired the statue, and he hired Dwayne Guernsey, who was the brother-in-law of the man that Jarvis Lord used to work for, and he's the one who came up with a sculpture that today is on top of Constellation Brands in downtown Rochester. On the other side of the house, there's also a fountain. This was from a company, the John D. Fisk Company in New York. It's a dolphin and fin zinc fountain, and that still exists on the other side of the main house. Next slide. Here's a picture of the fountain today in the back lawn. Next slide. And of course, here's Mercury today. Mercury, that's a block of Medina sandstone at the base of this. When there were cows, there were at least 2 times the cows escaped and knocked Mercury over. But he's been restored several times, and most recently when the new dairy was built in about, I think it's maybe 2012, he was put back out in the circle. Next slide. I'm sorry, this image, I didn't realize it was blurry when I downloaded it. I do have a clear version of this image. This is Frank and Estelle Hawley's son who did deliveries, and you can see originally all the milk that was sold was delivered to homes, and originally it was done with this cart. A little later, they had several trucks that delivered milk to people's homes. Next slide. This is a horse with one of the buggies in the winter. This is Fred Cook in later years with his dog. Behind him is a farm tenant house that was built about 1870. That house still exists and is occupied by an employee of the dairy. It's located right behind the dairy. This slide is interesting because this shows the building behind this. This was built as the farm office, and on the second floor there was a billiard room with a coved plaster ceiling. And eventually, Mrs. Hawley moved the dairy operations to this building so people could drive up in their cars and buy milk. I believe this is a float that was sponsored by the dairy in the 1939 sesquicentennial parade. It was a celebration of the Pittsford sesquicentennial. So that's what you're looking at in that picture. And you notice when we built the new dairy, we copied the board and batten siding that was on the old dairy. Next slide. Frank had a number of drawings that were done of the property. I showed you earlier a picture of the pond. You can see the pond and that little building in the background that still exists today. There's still a pond. There's a place on the farm. The pond is in a different location, but there's a view that if you go there today to the old cow pasture, it looks very much like this. Because the farm originally emphasized the production of cream and butter, originally they had a herd of Jersey cows, which is what these are. And that was, and there was, I believe they had about 80 cows at one point, and about maybe 75 cows were milked at the highest point. And at that time, because of they didn't have antibiotics, there was one point where I think it was mastitis wiped out the dairy herd and they had to start over. And there was another, I think it was distemper, wiped out the Shetland ponies. And at one point, I believe there's over 100 Shetland ponies that are buried in the old barnyard. It was, that's the type of thing that happened in the 19th century. Next slide. This is a view of the circle, and those are the Hawley's dogs on the left side, and this is a mixture of ponies and horses that were kept on the farm. There is a version of this that has the name of all these animals on it, and you can see the old barn is over here, the same location where the dairy barn remains today. Next slide. This is a close-up of the hitching posts that probably today we would consider this racist. You can see what is today a garage, which was a woodshed, and then the old dairy is visible just beyond that in this photograph. The Hawleys took this statue with them when they sold the property to my grandfather in 1946. Next slide. This is the same view from that view with the horses. This is the way it looks today with the new dairy. And you can see the dairy barn. This barn was built in 1970, but it's in the same location as the barn in the old lithograph. Next slide. Here's an advertisement. Basically, this is from the 20th century, but it says, "There is nothing that will please your child more than a Shetland pony, especially if the pony is from the excellent stock of the Pittsford Farm, where Shetlands are broken, trained, and cared for by children under the supervision of a competent manager. Every child appreciates a pony. It keeps them out in the open air and gives them plenty of good exercise and makes them healthy and strong. We have the pony that your child wants, also vehicles, saddles, harnesses, etc. For those who would raise ponies, we have for sale breeding and show ring stock of the finest blood." herd headed by Bresse of Pittsford and son of Lord of the Isles. Those are two ponies that were quite famous because of, they won a bunch of awards and shows. Next slide. This is interesting. Someone actually brought this into the dairy, and it's a 1916 receipt for a purchase of the total account was $6.47. Next slide. This is a picture of the house after the Hawleys had bought it. You can see that they redecorated with a late 19th century color scheme. Next slide. This is Estelle Hawley. Frank Hawley had a lot of what turned out to be fraudulent business interests, and eventually in 1898, after there were several articles in the Rochester papers questioning his finances, he disappeared and was never heard from again. And that remained a mystery until 2022, when members of his family came to and visited my brother and I with many historic photographs. And one of the members of the family actually researched and figured out what happened to Frank Hawley. Well, apparently he was a bit of a playboy, and he went to Europe, and he cajoled several wealthy ladies and bought a yacht and had a series of exploitive relationships in England, in France, in Italy, and he was eventually jailed in Italy, escaped, and then fled to Mexico, and they lost track of him. But after he disappeared, the Estelle Hawley loved the farm. She didn't want to go back to Brooklyn, where she had been from, and so the name of the farm was quietly put in the ownership of her uncle, Thomas Lamb. So the creditors never took the farm, and she managed the farm herself. And here she is on the back porch with some of the papers from 1898 until 1946, when she sold it. And she really deserves credit as one of the first female successful business people in Pittsford. And next slide. One of the things she did is, this is a truck, and again, I apologize for the quality of this. It's not the best, but this is one of the delivery trucks that was used in the 1930s. When the drivers threatened to unionize, Estelle fired them all, and she built a retail store, which many of you may remember was the old store that we used until 2010. Next slide. Estelle Hawley wanted to retire. Fred Cook was getting old. He was like a member of the family to the Hawleys, and essentially lived with them in the house. So when she moved out, they had photographs of the interior of the house taken when they moved in, and they also had photographs when they moved out. This is the dining room in 1946. Next slide. This is the double parlor. The view on the left looks towards Main Street. The view on the right looks back. It's a big, beautiful marble fireplace there. Next slide. This is the main stair, and this is a sun parlor that faces over the sunroom. What a nice room, huh? And next slide. This is the way it looks today. This is my parents' living room, which is what was the double parlor. Next slide. This is the marble, this important Carrara marble, very typical Renaissance revival style that was installed in the 1870s. There's a beautiful, actually the firebox is a molded piece of cast iron full of cherubs and highly decorated. Next slide. This is a view of the front hall today with the same stair you saw in the other photograph. Next slide. Here's Mercury in the 1940s. You can see the cars used to circulate around the driveway in the opposite direction they do today. And that's so the driver could get out easily and go directly into the store right out of there. And there's another picture of the old dairy. This was the store that Mrs. Hawley built in 1940. And this is the old farm office that was converted into a dairy plant. And here's Mrs. Hawley. This is probably done shortly after that was constructed, probably about 1940. Next slide. So she sold the farm to my grandfather and great-grandfather, Theodore J. Zorno and Theodore A. Zorno. My great-grandfather had just retired as superintendent of the Rochester City School District, and he wanted something to do. So he took over management of the dairy operation, and he began breeding Guernsey cows and showing them around the country with great success. My grandfather he was born on Knickerbocker Road on the Badams farm, and he had a passion for horse driving and especially standardbreds, and he began raising them and breeding them, and he needed a farm. He had established himself as a businessman in the 1930s by selling coal and produce on Shane Place and what today is the bean mill. He was very successful in World War II selling kidney beans to the troops and made quite a bit of money doing that. He also, in this photograph, he's standing in front of a coal hopper, and where the port of Pittsford Park is today, prior to the 1930s, all the barges on the canal were pushed by tugboats that were coal powered. And on the Shanes and at other places on the canal, coal was hand shoveled into the boats. My grandfather had the idea of having a hopper that would actually have chutes and much more quickly would deliver the coal to the boats by gravity. So trucks would back up on North Main Street and with a chute, dump coal into this hopper, and then the hoppers would then have chutes that would direct it into the coal. So within a few years, he grabbed almost the entire coaling business on the Erie Canal when there was a lot of freight on the canal still at that time. And eventually he opened another hopper in Sylvan Beach, which is just east of Syracuse. And my grandmother used to tell stories that in the middle of the night, because there was no throughway, he would spend 3 hours, get up and drive all the way to Sylvan Beach because somebody needed coal on the Erie Canal. But in any case, that's why he bought the farm. Mrs. Hawley was adamant because in the 1940s, when she was selling it, she didn't want to see it developed. And my grandfather and great-grandfather told her that they were going to use it for farming and they would not develop it. And that's part of the reason why the farm is still here today. Next slide. Ted was very successful with the breeding of standardbred horses, and he had a number of horses back when standardbred horse racing was quite popular before OTB and casino gambling became such a big thing. And this is Tarboy, one of his most famous race horses, and eventually became a very successful stud on the breeding operation. But Catbird and a number of other horses were bred on the farm, and it had a national profile. My grandfather for many years served as the president of the United States Trotting Association. Next slide. And this is an obituary for my grandfather, who did a variety of different things. He was a fire commissioner here in Pittsford for many years. He sat on the board of Nazareth, was active at U of R, and was engaged in many different things. Next slide. Here's a picture of this of the farm. This was done, I believe this is from the 1960s. And it shows you the peak development of it under my grandfather's operation. All those paddocks were for the horses. If you look closely, you can see a concrete block barn with small pens behind it. Before artificial insemination, those were the bullpens. You can see what had been the heifer barn at this point was used for horses. That's the barn that kind of sits by itself. You can see the old creamery near the top of the photograph. And what's also interesting, if at this point on Shane Place, John Shane's coal sheds were still in place, and there was probably still coal in the coal tower at this time. Next slide. Here's another view of the property. This was oh, I forgot the gentleman's name, but he had a plane and he took a number of aerial photographs of the area. And I'm glad it's a nice documentation of what it looked like in the 1960s. But you can see the size of the barn. There's two silos here. There's another silo here. The dairy is hidden in the trees in this photograph. This is North Main Street at the bottom of the photograph. And there were still active trains that provided freight service for the mills on Shane Place at that time. And the top of the photograph, you can see the horse pens. Next slide. In the my father took over operation of the dairy, and there he is on the right side of the photograph. And after he graduated from the U of R in 1961, I believe. And in the 1970s, the store was expanded slightly to this configuration, and that's Mercury. And these, I think a customer brought in these, the cow and the sheep that were in the circle there for a while. And this photograph is from, I believe, about 1980. Next slide. This photograph is my sister Kathy and I with a cow. And this was a publicity photograph that was in the Brighton Pittsford Post, and that's my dad. The date of this is about 1968, I believe. And that's a Guernsey cow. At that point, the farm had all Guernsey cows, and the butter fat for the whole milk that was sold in the store was about 4.8%. Today, all whole milk, which most of it's produced by Holstein cows, has a butter fat content of 3.4%. Next slide. So in October 20th, 1970, an arsonist lit the barn on fire, and that was a sad day that I remember clearly. The horses were left outside, so fortunately they weren't in the farm because the fire started in the wing of the barn with horse stalls. The cows were all in their stanchions, and my father, while the barn was burning, went in there and let the cows out. So the cows were let out into the courtyard, and they had to wait for the barn to burn down around them before they could be freed. And they were taken over the winter to a farm in Caledonia before being brought back here. I think they came back in about January. They put plastic over the foundation of the old barn, which survived. And then a new barn was built in the spring of 1971. Next slide. These are some more pictures of the fire, which I remember very clearly. And I put these in here because I remember watching this. There was just a puff of smoke that came up through the cupola, and then seconds later it burst into flames. And only a few minutes later, the whole barn was gone. And part of the problem was the barn had a metal roof, which held in the heat and allowed the fire to spread. The other problem was the DOT had shut off the fire hydrants. And so the 20 fire companies that came had to it took them a while to get water here because they had to set up pumping from the canal because the fire hydrants were not working. Next slide. Again, this is a picture of the old dairy that was functioned before the current one was built in 2010. This photo this is when the farm was placed on the National Register. So I think this photograph is from about 1995. Next photo. So when I designed the new dairy for my brother, obviously I took the architectural cues from the cupola, the board and batten siding, the window proportions, the proportions of the building from the cow barn that had burned in 1970. Because the dairy is in a historic district, we had to go before design review before the village's historic preservation board. And we spent quite a bit of time to try to figure out how to locate the dairy in a place that would not impair the historic character of the entire site and design something that actually fit the property. Next slide. These are Jersey cows every Christmas when we sell Christmas trees. Uh, we have two Jersey calves on site for Christmas. And next slide. This is a photograph I took a couple weeks ago of the farm, the fields and the farm. The Powers family has farmed the farm since the late 1960s. Roger Powers began using a wagon to sell pumpkins and sweet corn on Marsh Road in about, oh, I think maybe 1967, 68, something like that. And obviously the business has grown over the years. And his son Ned and his son-in-law Dan are the members that are active still farming this. But in the early 1990s, the town of Pittsford had a purchase of development right program. Historic Pittsford, along with the Pittsford Greenbelt Association, of which I was a member, lobbied the town to help preserve some of the remaining family farms that were left in town. So 8 farms, including this farm, were included in that. And what that meant was that the farmers, and in this case, it was the Powers family, sold the farm, the development rights to the town of Pittsford. The town of Pittsford acquired money to purchase them from the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, which had strict stipulations that the land always must be kept open and used for agricultural purposes. So the Powers could sell it to another farmer, but you could never build houses or a shopping mall here. It will always remain open space because of that program. And it was the Hopkins farm, the Willard farm, the Barker Knickerbocker farm, the Knickerbocker farm, the Sweeney farm, and the Snyder farm. And I'm forgetting one farm, the Shane farm. No, not the Shane farm. The other Hopkins farm were all included in that. And that's why most of the farmland that remains in Pittsford today was included in part of that program. Next slide. This was taken 2 weeks ago. This is the last year we had a herd of dairy cows at the Pittsford Farms was in 1987. We had a herd of about 50 milking cows at that time. Today, small dairy farms seem to have 800 cows, but it's typical to have 1,200 or even 2,000 cows because the economy of scale has changed so much in that time. I thought this was interesting because to get all the milk out of the truck, they actually pulled the truck up on those steel ramps that you see in the photograph. Next slide. Here's some pictures of the back of the farm. This is the pond that exists today. And these photographs are taken probably about 15 years ago. Looking towards the main barns, which you can see in the distance. There was an image earlier that I showed. This at one point was a blacksmith shop. Another point it was a hen house. But this building still exists. Next slide. This is the main farm lane that heads up from the barns out onto the farm. What's really interesting is the farm's located in the village, but once you go behind the barn, you feel like you're completely out in the country. One of the things that the Hawleys did is they planted sugar maples along all the farm lanes, and many of them exist today. Over on the right, you can see the blacksmith shop, the bull barn, and then there's a 19th century wagon barn, which all of those barns still exist today. The Powers family uses the blacksmith shop, or the bull barn is where they work on all their equipment. So it's a shop where tractors and everything are serviced. Next slide. This is an aerial view, which shows you how much farmland. People don't realize how much open land is back there, but this is Shane Place in the foreground, and that's the farm beyond there. All of basically everything that you see there is part of the purchase of development rights program. Next slide. Here's another view from a different angle. But what's nice about it is having the farm preserved really preserves kind of the rural context, so you get some idea of what it felt like to be in Pittsford Village, 100 years ago. And I think Pittsford is somewhat unique because the town has preserved so much open space bordering the village. So it has a much different feel than, say, Fairport, which is completely surrounded by suburban development. Next slide. Again, here's a picture of the dairy today. This one I took last fall. Next slide. Again, what's amazing is here's the four corners. I actually have a photograph of the same view from 1968. And other than a few changes, the fire department is new and there's one house that's gone and the library is new. The view looks almost exactly the same. And this, of course, is the farm on the entire top of the photograph beyond the canal. And just beyond there, you can see 490, and beyond that would be Monroe Golf Club. Next slide. That it? I guess that's it.
That appears to be it. Thank you so much, Bob, for that presentation. A lot of great information. We would like to open it up at this time. If anyone has any questions, you may put them in the chat or unmute and go ahead and ask your question. And the chat button you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen.
Bob, was Martin Wall the aerial photographer you were referring to?
Yeah, that is correct. Thank you. I couldn't remember the last name, but it was Wall. Yes, you are correct.
And of course, he's the brother of Tom Wall of the famous burger chain.
That's right. And Tom Wall's brother Bill, of course, ran an operation where the Pittsford Pub is located today. I have a great story. When I was growing up, the Bill Walls was in operation and they sold ice cream over there. And at one point, Roger and Betsy Powers had a couple of turkeys that they, at Thanksgiving, they would take them out to the farm market on Marsh Road. But the rest of the year, they just wandered around the barns. And those turkeys were smart. So they would occasionally wander over into the parking lot at Bill Wall's, and they would find the smallest child with an ice cream cone, and one of them would scare the kid, and then the other one would immediately eat the ice cream cone on the ground.
We have some questions in the chat. There are still Hildreths in town today. Are they descendants of Samuel Hildreth?
That I don't know. The Hawley family, which no longer, the members no longer live here, but they did visit my brother and I in September of 2022 and provided a whole bunch of information that we didn't have before in many photographs. They also mentioned that Thomas Lamb, Estelle Hawley's uncle, his son was actually the architect for the Empire State Building in New York City. But I don't know about the Hildreths. I do know that my father and also Mike Newcomb are descendants related to Samuel Hildreth.
We have another question. Can you tell us more about the two houses behind the current dairy?
Yes. The one house, you saw both of them in the images here. One of them was the original creamery that I think there were two images in my presentation that showed that. And the other one was a tenant house for farmers on there that today is occupied by a refugee Afghani family, one of whom is an employee who works in the dairy.
You mentioned the term mile square. Does that term, as you used it, relate to the origin of the name of the road, Mile Square Road?
No, I think it's completely different. This was, and I don't think the circumference is quite a mile, but it's that's what it was always known as, and it was laid out in the 1890s by Frank Hawley. And you can still see it here today. It was somewhat modified when the expressway came through. But if you go out on the back of the farm, the farm lanes are still lined with these sugar maples. And the back of the farm is still one of the most beautiful places I know of in Pittsford.
I see another one here. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Can you identify who Shoney were? Schony?
Shoney. Shoney. Can you identify who Shoney were? The Shanes?
Perhaps they mean Shane.
Oh, Shots. There were also, well, the Shanes were the people that John Shane built the coal tower on Shane Place and had a produce and coal business and also sold farm implements early in the 20th century. And he operated that until the 1960s when he sold the property to Ted Collins, who moved his landscape business there before starting the conversion into the restaurants and retail things that exist today. And Ted Collins' daughter, Jennifer Collins, and her son are the owners, and they operate it today. Also, there's also the Shantz family. Frank and Estelle Hawley had two daughters. Florence, her last name when she was married was Shantz, Schantz, and they lived on South Main Street in the house that today is the administrative offices for St. Louis Church. After Estelle Hawley sold the farm, she moved to the rectory of St. Louis. That was their house. That's where they lived. And Fred Cook, the farm manager, moved with her to that house. Her daughter, also named Estelle, was, I believe, the first female to graduate from the University of Rochester School of Medicine. And she had a career as a renowned nutritionist. And eventually, after her mother died, she actually lived on my street here on Washington Avenue. But she was another, Pittsford has had a remarkable number of women who were ahead of their time. And both Estelle and her daughter, Estelle, fit into that category.
We had another one. Any plans to renovate or restore that original creamery behind the dairy? A fascinating building. It's a fascinating building.
We have studied that. In fact, we had to move the dairy to build that building to move the new dairy. The problem is its interior arrangement doesn't, because it was an ice house and there's all these different floor levels. In the 20s, they converted it into apartments. And it's just not going to be feasible, I don't believe, to renovate. We are working on a plan to address some of the deficiencies of the dairy, so we'll probably do some sort of expansion in the next few years. But that's part of the plan, is we're trying to figure out how all of that is going to work. Obviously, it's important that we're going to try to, as much as possible, to maintain the historic character of the property.
We have another, what's the production process that makes your ice cream so good?
I think it's the ingredients, because we don't scrimp on any of the ingredients, and it's all handmade, hand mixed and hand packed right there. You can actually, if you go into the dairy and you look in the window, usually on Tuesdays and Fridays, although sometimes during the summer they do it more often. Those are the days when they generally make ice cream. The milk also, I think, when my father took over operation of the dairy in 1961, there were 40 independent dairies in the Rochester region. Today, there's just two, us and Upstate Milk, and they've tried several times to put us out of business. But the reason our milk tastes better is because we still vat pasteurize it. Most dairies use short-term pasteurization. They pipe milk through superheated plates that essentially scorches it and changes the flavor profile. We pasteurize in a vat for 100 to 145 degrees for 45 minutes, and it still tastes like raw milk. I can't drink other people's milk.
Many people,
Go ahead.
Many people here would remember Red McConnell's Dairy, right near the your farm. And I remember him telling my father, "Don't ever go into the ice cream business. It just is so much work to make good ice cream."
You know, it's interesting because I remember Bill Walls, and as a kid, we all went over there, you know, and that's where people gathered. And I think it's gratifying. I think the dairy we lost Hicks, we lost Burdett's, we lost the hardware store, we lost Bill Wall's. But I think the dairy, fortunately, I think provides that sense of a gathering space. And, during the years that I was mayor, we worked hard to try to figure out how can the village retain that role in the future, and by keeping the library, keeping the rec center, keeping the town hall, keeping all those functions in the village center. So we actually, it's not like Penfield where there's nothing left at the Four Corners. It really is a place that people go to. And, I think as a family, I think we're proud that the dairy is part of that.
On a more serious note, we have, when the barn burned in 1970, did they catch the arsonist?
Yes, they did. The story with the arsonist, he was a former employee who had been drinking on the job, and he was fired. And apparently that night he had gone out drinking and came back to the farm and slept overnight in the hayloft, and the barn had just been loaded with hay the night before. So it was a tinderbox ready to go. After this fire, he apparently burned down 2 other barns near Leroy and Stafford, New York. And in one of those barns, a person died. So he went to jail for a long time.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, we want to thank all of you for coming this evening, and thank you again, Bob, for sharing that wealth of information and your family's history and photographs. Our mission is to provide leadership, advocacy, and education to preserve Pittsford's diverse historic resources. If you would like to support us, you may become a member or perhaps volunteer for one of our upcoming events. So we want to thank you all again for joining us, and we hope that we will see you again soon.